I have what I call a flex sermon today, meaning I can shorten it or extend it depending on audience participation. Kind of reminds me of a friend that I had when I was working in Venezuela. His family, very hospitable. They'd always say, "Come on over." And sometimes I'd be a little reluctant because I'd say, "Well, you hadn't planned for me to come over." And he said, "Hey, come on over, it makes no difference." Of course, he wasn't the one having to cook. But he'd say, "We could just add a little more water to the soup. That'll be enough for everybody." And then there usually was. It was more than enough for everybody. Recently, I was reading an article on the discovery of Ostraca. Now, Ostraca, in case you're wondering, it's not a place near Australia. It's nowhere down under. It's little potsherds, little pieces of clay tablets with inscriptions written on them. And usually the inscriptions were names of people together with insults. And these were discovered in Greece because they date back to the 5th century BC in Athens. And what would happen was, at the beginning of each year, apparently, the men of Athens would decide, well, we want to improve the atmosphere of the city, and in order to do that, we need to throw somebody out. There's somebody we don't like, so we're going to kick him out. And so what they would do is they would put names on these little tablets, these little potsherds, and whoever received the most votes would have to leave Athens for a year. In some cases, I think they left for 5 years. In other cases, they were banished for 10 years. And of course, that's the origin of our word ostracism. When we talk about ostracism, it comes from these little tiles or potsherds and so on. And apparently, some of the insults were pretty raunchy that were written about people. And so banishment, going back to the 5th century BC, was used in Athens as a political weapon, as punishment. And recent studies suggest it was a weapon that reflected on the popularity or unpopularity of the person being kicked out. So banishment has been around for a long time. And also it's there sometimes on a person-to-person level. This is on a city level, on a political level. But it also occurs on the personal level. Sometimes we talk about giving a person the silent treatment. You all heard that? Sometimes we've been on the receiving end. I remember one time I fell out with my sister. This was many years ago when we were still living together. And I did something pretty bad, I guess. And she responded by giving me the silent treatment, would not talk to me. I think this lasted for about 2 weeks. And it really hurt. I didn't realize how much it would hurt. Something then happened and we reconciled. But in England, we also used to say sending someone to Coventry. Anybody heard that expression? You send someone to Coventry? Well, Coventry is a town in the heart of England, but I don't know that it has anything to do with actually sending them there. It's just the expression that you would treat someone. I think they feel that it may date back to the English Civil War in the 17th century. And the idea was that you could have someone in your midst, but you pretend he's not there. So if he talks to you, don't answer. So you're giving him the silent treatment, but the whole group is doing that. So we have several words for this kind of response. We talk about blacklisting. You may remember during the post-war period, people suspected of having been communists, or people who had been communists, were very often blacklisted, which meant they couldn't work in their field of endeavor. We've also heard of the term from India, pariah. In India, when they had, I guess they still in a way have a caste system, although it's not official, but you had members of different castes, and people who belonged to the lowest social caste were considered unclean and therefore outcasts from the rest of the community. And so we've taken that term pariah to mean the same kind of thing, someone who is an outcast, a social outcast. And so there are very different forms, or several different forms, I should say, of doing this, of banishing people or blacklisting people. We do it even in prisons. We have, even though we would say, well, prison is a form of banishment from society, which it is, But even within a prison, you can have solitary confinement. You can give someone the silent treatment. And in fact, it is considered by some to be a form of torture to do that, because we human beings are social creatures. God said it was not good for the man to be alone. He realized we need interaction with one another. And so this is considered a form of punishment. We do it on a nation-to-nation level. How many of you heard of economic sanctions? You know, where we isolate a country by saying, okay, you cannot do business with us or with any of the other countries who do business with us. And that's been done in the past, sometimes with success. For example, the Botas, I'm sure will remember the sanctions that were imposed on South Africa for many years to kind of force them to get rid of apartheid and so on. And right now, I think there's some who are using those against Israel, encouraging people to divest, to take out their money from investments in Israel and so on. And so human beings have long used this tactic to pressure others to conform. I mean, when they used it in Athens, clearly most people did not want to be kicked out of town, so they would perhaps try to conform, make sure people liked them. But it happens no matter what people may do on occasion. I was, as a person who enjoys reading about history, I was thinking about Stalin, our, famous leader of the Soviet Union, who succeeded Lenin. But of course, there was a power struggle after Lenin died between him and Trotsky, and Stalin won. And then, of course, what happens to the loser? Well, in Trotsky's case, he's banished. He's kicked out. He's kicked out of the country. He's kicked out of the party. His name is besmirched. And eventually Stalin sends an assassin over to kill him in Mexico. So he definitely, suffered the worst fate that one could as someone who has been banished. But I've also seen it on a lower level of operation. I have some friends, and I won't mention which town they are in, but this actually happens to be a couple of brothers who are now estranged, don't talk to each other because of some issue that occurred. And I don't want to elaborate on that, but again, they decided, well, that's it. That's enough to cause this rift, this separation. So very often it is used as a form of punishment, political punishment. But it is also used in religious settings. And of course, here we are in a religious setting, and so I think it's entirely appropriate for us to consider this. And in religious settings, it sometimes has a different name. Sometimes the name that is used is shunning. You talk about people shunning others. In other groups, it's called excommunication. In yet other groups, it's called disfellowshipment. I think we're all familiar with at least one of those terms. And that has even happened in this congregation, or with this congregation, over the years. People have become estranged, people have shunned other people, etc. So what do we find in the Bible on this topic? And as I was preparing this message, I found there was so much information you could really write a book. And I'm not going to do that today. We only have so much time. If I exceed my time, I know I will be shunned for a long time to come. But I'll just hit some of the highlights as I was looking into this topic. Leviticus 13, for example, you don't need to go there, but Leviticus 13 deals with leprosy. The topic is leprosy. And so in the community, people with leprosy were temporarily banished. They were required to be outside the camp. Why? Well, because leprosy is contagious. It was considered contagious, considered infection. So the priest would observe, see if the leprosy is spreading, check out the house, if necessary, demolish the house to prevent the spread of leprosy. So the purpose was to remove contagion. And of course, sometimes there's a spiritual lesson in that for us. Later, in Numbers 12, if you want to jot that down, there's the example of Miriam, Aaron and Miriam. Both challenged Moses. And they say, Moses, who do you think you are? You think God only speaks through you? What about us? We're just as good as you are. We're just as important as you are. And this does not sit well with God. And as a result, Miriam is smitten with leprosy and is required to remain outside the camp for 7 days. I mean, Moses prays to God to heal her, and God does, but he said, look, she should learn a lesson, stay outside the camp for at least a week. And everybody waited, and obviously everybody knew, because the word would spread and say, hey, why aren't we moving? Well, we have to stay here to wait for Miriam. And why Miriam? Well, she's got leprosy. Why does she have leprosy? Well, because she challenged Moses, and God smote her with leprosy. Later, we read about King Uzziah of Judah, and this is in 2 Chronicles 26. You go there. Again, you don't have to go there, but he was basically a good king. You know how a lot of these kings were not, even in Judah later on. But he went a little too far and took on the role of a priest. And as a result, he was stricken with leprosy and had to live separate from everybody else for the rest of his life. So he was banished in that sense because of sin, of disobedience, of arrogance. In fact, I really enjoyed and appreciated Mr. Bota's Bible study on Nebuchadnezzar when we were hearing about Daniel 4, because in effect, Nebuchadnezzar was banished for those 7 times from society, while he is having to learn the lesson that God wanted him to learn. So he's an outsider. And so in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, we see very often that the outsiders, the people who are outside the camp, are unclean, are there because they're unclean, and we don't want that uncleanness to infect the rest of the congregation, the rest of the assembly. They're impure, and therefore they have to be rejected. And perhaps some of that has stayed with people over the centuries. This is not unique perhaps to Israel, but sometimes when you think of xenophobia and attitudes that people have towards the foreigner, the stranger, well, they're unclean, they're impure, there's something wrong, there's something bad, and sometimes that attitude remains. But what should be our approach in the church? I remember hearing back in the distant past messages about marking. Those of you who were in Worldwide probably remember. How many of you remember hearing something about marking? Yes. Yeah. All right. And I think it was elevated almost to the level of a doctrine. Well, I looked up the word that's translated mark, and it's Greek skopeo, which is the word that our word scope comes from, to scope out, that term, and basically means to just keep an eye on, look out for. It's not a ceremony, it's not an official ecclesiastical action, it's just watch out, look out, just be aware of. For example, it's used in Galatians 6:1, where we read, brothers and sisters, if a person is discovered in some sin, you who are spiritual, restore such a person in a spirit of gentleness, paying close attention to yourselves so that you're not tempted too. That's the word skopeo. Pay close attention to yourself. So you're helping someone, but look out and watch yourself. Watch your own conduct there, skopeo. It's also used in Luke 22 when Peter is there warming himself after Jesus has been arrested. And it says that a slave girl saw Peter and stared at him. She sort of recognized, well, that's the word skopeo. So she's really looking carefully at Peter. And so on. So that's what the word mark, that is translated mark in English, means. So in Romans 16:17, which I think was the passage that we would usually go to, Paul is writing. So in Romans 16:17, we read, now I urge you, brothers and sisters, and it says mark in the King James Version, but in this translation that I'm reading from, it says watch out for. Doesn't mean you have to go through some ceremony. It's just watch out, be careful. Watch out for those who create dissensions and obstacles contrary to the teaching that you've learned, avoid them. These are the kind who do not serve our Lord Christ, but their own appetites. By their smooth talk and flattery, they deceive the minds of the naive. But you just watch out for them. Is there some kind of church ceremony involved? No. Just be aware of that. Just keep an eye out for them. You know, in the same way that perhaps today we have to keep an eye out for people who would try to scam us on the internet. You know, the school district where I work at, they have required us to take several courses in technology, particularly in terms of avoiding scams, avoiding phishing and spear phishing and all sorts of things, and I forget all the vocabulary, but they tell us, you know, there are always people out to get control of your computer. So watch out for that. There's no specific ceremony involved. It's just be careful and be aware of these are some of the things that can happen. So be on the watch. Philippians 3:17 is another use of the word skopeo. I'll just add that to the others I've given you, where Paul says, be imitators of me and watch carefully those who are living this way, just as you have us as an example. So that's really what it means. Just be careful. Couple of other scriptures, and you can just make a note of these in 2 Thessalonians 3, verses 14 through 15. Paul writes, if anyone does not obey our message through this letter, take note of him. Do not associate closely with him, so that he may be ashamed, yet do not regard him as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. So clearly, if somebody is coming to you with a message that is negative, a message that contradicts everything that you believe, you don't have to be a close buddy, but you don't treat him as an enemy either. It's not a political move that you take. In 2 Thessalonians 3, verses 6 and 7, earlier in that same chapter, Paul had written, we command you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to keep away from any brother who lives an unruly or undisciplined life. Well, in that particular context, he's talking about people who are trying to be idle, who try to get without giving, or eating without working, and so on. So that seems to be the particular context there. And then one more scripture I think that we need to look at is in 3 John. 3 John. All right. Sorry, 2 John. 3 John comes later. 2 John. In 2 John 8, it tells us to watch out. Let's start in verse 7. Many deceivers have gone out into the world, people who do not confess Jesus as Christ coming in the flesh. This person is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch out so that you do not lose the things we've worked for. Going on, verse 10, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house, and do not give him any greeting. So again, there are warnings against associating too closely with people who will cause you to go off the path that you've been called to follow. So be careful, be watchful, as I was saying, we should be with technology, and don't become too close. But again, there is not some official ceremony banishing this individual. And in fact, now let's go to 3 John. I think this would be a good time to go there. 3 John, we see one individual in the New Testament who is actually using this as a political tool. 3 John 9, let's read there. 3 John 9, I wrote to the congregation, but Diotrephes, who enjoys taking the lead, he likes being in charge, will have nothing to do with us. And so when I come, I will draw attention to the things he's doing. He lays nonsensical and spiteful charges against us. Not content with that, he refuses to receive fellow Christians himself and interferes with those who would receive them and tries to expel them from the congregation. So here we see someone who is actually using this as a weapon, using this expulsion, this separation of people as a weapon, and John condemns it. John condemns it. One of the things that we should keep in mind as we look at the whole Old Testament about this topic is caution. One awareness of the importance of caution. For example, and again I'll just reference a couple of chapters in Matthew. Matthew 13 talks about separating the wheat and the chaff. What did Jesus say about that? He said, well, you know, once the chaff starts to grow, you really can't tell, so let them both grow together until the end. I'll do the separating later. What about the sheep and the goats? When are they separated? Is it a requirement the church separate them? No, that occurs also at the end. What about the wise and foolish virgins? When does the separation occur? Again, that occurs at the end. You can't always tell who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11 that Satan himself uses a disguise. He appears as an angel of light. And so we should be very careful about assuming that we know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. Now clearly, there are things that we would realize are trying to lead us astray, particularly in certain behavioral areas. But in a lot of other areas, we can't be so sure. So we need to do what we are convicted about our behavior, but also be careful about banishing or shunning or avoiding others. Let's remember in 2 Peter 3:9 that God says that he's not willing that any should perish. Ultimately, God wants us all to be in his family. That is his desire. The other thing I want to mention that needs to be perhaps a word of caution to all of us is not confusing our personal opinions with our religious beliefs. Not confusing our political opinions with our religious beliefs. I think it's very easy to do that. And I had the opportunity earlier in life to do a certain amount of travel, and I realized that all of us come from a particular background. I'll give you the example. When I was working in Peru, much of the congregation in the church, these were believers, fellow believers, had come out of, for want of a better term, a Marxist background, left-wing political background. And so how did they see the world? They saw the world basically maybe an anti-capitalist perspective. They thought of capitalism as being somewhat oppressive. Now, we didn't discuss politics per se in church, but can you understand that they had a particular political background that maybe influenced how they saw things in life in general? And yet they were brothers and sisters. You know, we too come from a particular political background, all of us. But let's go back to the Old Testament. You all remember Cornelius, the centurion. What was he? Jewish or Roman? Yeah, he's Roman. He's a Roman. He's a Roman soldier. He's a centurion. How does he look at things versus a Jewish Christian? Did Jews look at the Romans the same way as the Romans viewed the Romans? Presumably not. And yet they're both Christians, they're both brothers. So we have to be careful about not confusing our political opinions, our political antecedents and backgrounds with our religious views. I remember back in '82 dealing with some friends from Argentina, and at that time I claimed British nationality. And there was an issue over the Falklands. Some of you may remember. Of course, as I look around, yeah, you're all old enough to remember. Yeah, Falklands, Malvinas, and it was interesting because the resentment was just underneath the surface. As I talked to some of my Argentine brothers, friends, I could see that there was still some of that background resentment that influenced their view. And undoubtedly they would be able to say the same thing about me. So let's try to boil this down. Does that mean we should not do anything if people are leading us astray, that we should just not worry about it? Well, no, I'm not saying that. I think what we need to understand is that the responsibility ultimately is going to be a personal responsibility. There is a role for the church as an institution, but ultimately I think we have to prepare individuals to make their choices. Proverbs tells us, Proverbs 22:24, don't become friends with an angry man. Why not? Aren't there qualities that an angry man can have that are good for us to learn from? Absolutely. But if you're around too many angry people, the warning is you might learn to be an angry person yourself. All right? So maybe you just keep a little distance there between you and him. Also in Proverbs 22, talks about driving out the scorner and contention will leave. That always reminds me of removing a disruptive student from a class. There's all of a sudden there's a lot more can get accomplished. So there is a time for that. The section that we would want to look at there would be Matthew 18. Matthew 18 verses 15 to 18. But if you look at Matthew 18, you realize that the purpose is to restore a relationship. Matthew 18 talks about, okay, if your brother sins, if there's some problem going on, go tell him. Just take it at the lowest level possible. If he won't listen, okay, go with somebody else, again, seeking to reconcile. If that doesn't work, take it to the church, and we could debate what that means exactly. But again, you're taking it maybe to the local congregation, the leadership in the local congregation. If he refuses to listen, treat him like a Gentile or a tax collector. And what does that mean? How do you treat a Gentile or a tax collector? How did Jesus treat a Gentile or a tax collector? How did Jesus treat Samaritans? He ate with tax collectors, right? He ate with lepers. So he didn't reject them. He didn't banish them. You just, you're careful. If you know somebody is advocating for a particular heresy, let's use that term, say, I don't want to talk about that. If I'm going to be with you, we're not going to discuss that. If you insist on discussing that, then I guess I can't spend time with you. I'm not going to do that. So the purpose, the goal there is reconciliation. In Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 5, Paul talks about a man who was engaged in sin. He had to be removed. But that was a very obvious and apparently deliberate and publicly viewed sin. And this person did not seem to want to change. Those kinds of situations are going to be rare. And ultimately the goal is going to be that reconciliation. You have to be careful about just quickly wanting to do like Diotrephes and kick people out. Jesus warned in John 16, he warned his disciples that, what's going to happen in the future? People are going to kick you out of the synagogue. They're going to banish you. You're going to be the object of that separation. So if that's going to be the case, what should you engage in? Should you be the ones who are actively doing that? No. Not everybody got kicked out in the early church. There were some, I guess, really bad examples. You had Ananias and Sapphira. Now, they got truly kicked out, right? They were killed. You had Simon the sorcerer. He is banned. But they were serious threats. But there were some people who said, Paul said, that there's no resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15, he said, well, those of you who say there's no resurrection, well, there's no resurrection, then Jesus wasn't resurrected. But does he say kick them out because they happen to say that? No, he just says, look, here's the truth. Understand the truth. But you don't get kicked out. So what should we do? Well, if there is contagion, you have to protect people. You give them protection. You help them to develop some form of immunity. Right now, there is a coronavirus wreaking havoc in China, in Wuhan, particularly in Hubei province. And a lot of people have become infected. And people are concerned about how much this might spread. Well, where there is contagion, let's go to 2 Timothy 2. What is it that we should do? Let's look at 2 Timothy 2, and I think we'll find some good advice here. 2 Timothy 2, starting in verse 14. Keep on reminding people of this and charge them solemnly before God to stop disrupting about mere words. It does no good, only ruins those who listen. And sometimes we've encountered that. But try hard to show yourself worthy of God's approval as a worker with no cause for shame. Keep strictly to the true gospel, avoiding empty and irreligious chatter. Those who indulge in it will stray farther and farther into godless ways, and the infection of their teaching will spread like gangrene. Such are Hymenaeus and Philetus in saying that our resurrection has already taken place. They're wide of the truth and undermine people's faith. But God has laid a foundation stone, and it stands firm, bearing this inscription, "The Lord knows his own." And then he goes on to say that there are in any house, verse 20, utensils of gold, silver, wood, earthenware. And so people will be evaluated. But what should you do in the meantime? Well, verse 22, he tells Timothy, turn from the wayward passions of youth, pursue justice, integrity, love, peace, together with all who worship the Lord in singleness of mind. Have nothing to do with foolish and wild speculations. They breed quarrels. And a servant of the Lord must not be quarrelsome. He must be kindly towards all. He should be a good teacher, tolerant and gentle when he must discipline those who oppose him. And God may then grant them a change of heart and lead them to recognize the truth. And thus they may come to their senses and escape from the devil's snare in which they have been trapped and held at his will. So he's telling Timothy, learn to be a good teacher. Be prepared to withstand any kind of false teaching. So you equip people so that they can be able to discern what are the dangers, the sources of whether it be heresy or other problems that might attack us. We found out over 25 years ago that many people did not have the tools they needed to defend themselves. Maybe the ministry and others had not lived up to their responsibility by preparing people fully to withstand those kinds of attack. Because I believe the New Testament shows us clearly that God's goal is always reconciliation. He wants his people united. He wants his people together. Now we have to be protected. That's why there are shepherds. But the shepherds, in the case of the church, prepare the sheep to learn to protect themselves so that we can withstand all these threats to our beliefs and our convictions. Let's close by going to John, a couple of scriptures in John. John 13. Remember that God hates divorce. We read about that in Malachi. God hates separation. God made human beings to be together. He made us not just man and woman, but he made us to be in the church, in community. He says we shouldn't forsake the assembling of ourselves together. So it's not his desire for us to have to separate. His desire is for us to be united. And here in John 13, verses 34 and 35, he says, I give you a new commandment, love one another. As I have loved you, so you are to love one another. If there is this love among you, then everyone will know that you are my disciples. That will be a witness to people of the truth of the message. Can we truly say that we have all lived up to that calling? In John 17, several times in this prayer, Jesus prays to the Father that we could be one, could be or can be united. In verse 11, he says, Holy Father, protect them by the power of your name, the name you have given me, that they may be one as we are one. And then in verses 20 through 23, It is not for these alone that I pray, but for those also who through their words put their faith in me. May they all be one. As you, Father, are in me, and I in you, so also may they be in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. The glory which you gave me I have given to them, that they may be one, as we are one. I in them, and you in me, that they may be perfectly one. Then the world will know that you sent me, and that you loved them as you loved me. So even though there may be a time and a place for people to be briefly separated in order to help them learn a lesson, an important lesson, ultimately God wants us to protect the flock, prepare the flock, reconcile those who have left, be reunited and be one. And if we truly live up to that, just think what a tremendous witness that would be to everybody who sees it.